And I am trying to make the case for migration systems as an idea. I think maybe some of the discussion we need to have is, and it's a discussion we've gone round and round in the THEMIS project, has been, yeah, the system, what does it mean? And I think maybe there's an element of we're talking about maybe rather different things when we're using the language of system, and it might be the wrong term. But what I want to suggest is that despite being problematic and often satisfactory, this idea of the migration system, it just keeps coming back. It seems to be rather compelling. Because we are faced, when we're trying to understand migration, we're faced with a complex array of different elements that define migration processes. We've got to make sense of factors that are spread across space, in origin and destination and places in between, and of course more complex movements that aren't just between origin and destination. There's a whole range of places we have to consider. Things are changing over time, and we're also trying to wrestle with what we see, that people are moving, they are making their own decisions. We can't deny their agency. But they're also moving within a very strong structural constraints. So how do we make sense of that? And we seem to keep coming back to something like a system. So what I'm suggesting is, okay, let's run with that and just try and develop something a bit more theoretically robust, rather than abandon it and then we reinvent it later with a different name, maybe with a different name. So what I want to do is to put forward a revised definition of a migration system. I'm going to start with the work of Mabugunje from the 1970s. I'm going to present very brief argument here. It's one that's elaborated in much more detail in an article that's about to be published in the journal Migration Studies. And I think you have sort of preprint copies of that on your USBs. And in the second half of the paper, the talk, I'm going to illustrate the application of the idea I'm putting forward with some of the empirical data from the THEMIS project. And I'm particularly looking at how what I'm talking about as migration systems come to start up or emerge. So I'm going to start with Mabugunje, who was writing in 1970. And he was inspired by the ideas of general systems theory, particularly that of Bertalanffy, I might be massacring his name, from 1950, that was still rather in fashion. I think there's actually a lot more to this than what Parsons actually ran with. I think there's some very interesting ideas there, but I won't go into that now. For Mabugunje, he defined a migration system as a complex of interacting elements together with attributes and relationships. And this gave rise to self-perpetuating regular patterns of exchange between particular localities. The set of relationships was somewhat stable across space and time. And this was set within a wide environment. But I think there he was very vague. It's sort of the universe or phenomena, which is of interest in a given context. I'm not sure that said anything at all. So the environment was vague. But what he really, I think, the advance he brought in was the recognition of the critical role of feedback from earlier migration that changes the subsequent pattern of movement. So in particular, information about the migrants' reception and progress at destination is transmitted back to the place of origin, and that may, if it's favourable, encourage further migration. And for Mabugunje, the migration system links people's families and communities over space in what today might be called transnational or translocal communities. And this was then taken up by Kritz, Lim et al., Wright, and they wrote about into the realm of international migration. And they talked more in terms of people moving between nations. Douglas Massey's concept of cumulative causation developed the idea of feedback, showing how the exchange of information and assistance could lead to the expansion of migration through social networks. And beyond a certain threshold, this process could become self-sustaining. And Thomas Weiss has also worked on this, sort of refining the idea by talking about the negative role of this feedback in dampening down the operation of migration systems. But what's lacking in all this discussion about systems has been any idea of how these things start up. There is a problem. How, a system, if you're going to talk about a system, where does it come from? How does the change happen? And if we're talking about a threshold, how can we know when that threshold is reached, or even if it ever will be? And this was something that Hein wrote about in 2010, and presented some very critical questions. And those were the critical questions that we took up in the THEMIS project to some extent, provided our basic questions. We wanted to understand the conditions under which migration systems were formed or not, and when they might decline. But having put migration systems at the heart of the project, it's a rather weak guide for the empirical research because we didn't have a clear definition that we were happy to work with. What we did note, we weren't concerned with just crude counts of migrants moving between countries. It might show up patterns worthy of exploration, point us towards interesting cases, but we wanted to understand how those patterns were formed. We wanted to understand the changing configuration of factors that shaped these patterns. And we were very concerned about these mechanisms. And we talked in terms of the social mechanisms by which migration in one period affected later movements. So we really got interested in the dynamics of migration within particular corridors, as we called them, looking for evidence of systemic properties, if you like. So it forced us to rethink from the start our idea about a migration system. And we've been debating this through the project. Some remain ambivalent about the value of the concept and wary of the connotations in the language of systems, especially with its still strong resonance with functionalism. Others take it as a good heuristic device to bring together ideas about factors shaping migration, but don't particularly want to get into defining it. I'm maybe stepping out on a limb here because I think we could ask a bit more from the idea of systems. Given we do see patterned relationships between different social actors and institutions, it seems important to think about the theoretical relationships between those. And perhaps we may enable us to draw comparisons between different systems and make some theoretical claims about how they may evolve. So I started with Mabagunji's idea of systems. I think it's actually quite a good starting point because he's clearly distinguishing between the system elements and their attributes and relationships. And I put this together as maybe a more abstract idea of the system, thinking of it in terms of its interacting elements that relate to migration between localities. And I thought we could differentiate those elements, maybe think about the flows of people, ideas, and goods. We also have the institutions in the sense of discourses and associated practices, perhaps thinking of the culture of migration, institutions of smuggling, and also institutions of inequality. And I mean, listening to Thomas, I think there's many points of connection here that I could make if we'd maybe had this exchange before. So it's fantastic it starts now. I know I'm going to be rewriting this paper. And another part of this is strategies, thinking of the plans for action by particular actors. We could be talking about individual household strategies, but also the policies of governments, the plans of private businesses, maybe civil society organisations. So all these elements relate to migration between localities. But along with that, we also need to understand the dynamics governing how these elements change and how they change in relation to changes in other system elements. And there that's what I refer to as feedback mechanisms, but also changes in the wider environment. And very simplistically, I've tried to sort of map out some of these elements. This is just putting together some plausible elements to try and give you a sense of some of the examples I would be thinking about here. And I've chosen for now to distinguish them according to whether they're mainly associated with the origin, they're sitting in between and spanning transnational or translocal space, or maybe they're particularly identified with the destination. I'm not happy with this table yet, and again, I want to rework it in the light of what we've just heard. But it's here just to serve an illustration for the discussion. In order to define the system dynamics, we have to necessarily spoke both the internal feedback mechanisms and the relationships between changes in the system elements and the wider environment. And when I talk feedback mechanisms, I'm referring to the ways in which migration at one time induces changes in other elements of the system. So things that are going on sort of with things within this table, say. So how it is that it may be that changes in the flows of migration may actually then be changing the formation of the practices or the attitudes towards migration, changing those institutes. It may also be spurring states to take different attitudes towards migration and developing new policies. And these things are working through, and that will in fact, that will come back and change the flows. And you can think of many different connections you can make between these different elements. But it certainly reaches beyond simply remittances and migrant networks. The other aspect of the system dynamics, in my idea I'm presenting here, is the relation between the system elements and the wider environment. And here I take the wider environment to mean that those objects or factors where feedback mechanisms cannot be plausibly identified. Of course, and that will create a lot of discussion. But we can identify some likely environmental factors, like rainfall, disease, political conflict, technological change, and of course the ongoing global economic crisis. I wouldn't lay that at the door of migration, or say that migration can plausibly be said to have been really affected that. Once you start to see connections being made between these, maybe you start to bring them into the system. I'm very aware at this point, I feel I should have a snazzy diagram to present to you to illustrate these points. I don't for two reasons. First, I'm reluctant to pin it down to a diagram of arrows and boxes, and I've yet to get the technological ability and the imagination to work out how to present a more dynamic representation. So that's my ambition for the future. But of course it will be reworked in the light of what Thomas has said. But unlike Mabagunje's system, that envisaged an identifiable geographical structure that persists over space and time, that's not what I'm talking about here. Here the stability is found in those dynamics, where the same relationships between different elements persist over time. So to some extent, I'm interested in understanding the rules of the game that govern the emergence of new elements in the system, rather than just the flows between places. So that's very briefly outlining the idea that I want to put forward for rethinking migration systems. I want to now explore this through some of the THEMIS data. And again, I feel this is a very preliminary take on a limited part of the THEMIS data. Just to let you know, and again, you will see a lot of this in other presentations. We worked with 3 origin countries, Brazil, Morocco and Ukraine. We looked at 3 destinations, Netherlands, Norway and Portugal. And I should stress, within each of these, so 4 destination countries. Within each of these we were looking at particular localities. I'm not going to go into the details. But we were doing semi-structured interviews in origin and destination, and also random sample survey. I'm just looking at 3 corridors, we tend to refer to them in the discussion. Brazilians moving to Norway, Ukrainians moving to Portugal, and Ukrainians moving to the UK. And I'm going to go through this and thinking about the way these systems, the way movements started, the way the feedback mechanisms seem to be kicking off, and also some points about the environment. So these three corridors, the case of Ukrainians moving to Portugal shows the most dramatic start. Up to the mid-late 90s, Portugal was almost unheard of as a destination for Ukrainians. But over the next 6 years or so, up to about 2004, thousands of Ukrainians moved to work on the booming construction sites of Portugal, in particular build the stadium for the European Cup in 2004. And they formed the largest group of foreign nationals in the country in the early 2000s, which is a remarkable expansion of migration. This initial movement appears from the response we've talked and from other sources. It appears to be particularly stimulated by a combination of institutional factors. High unemployment in Ukraine, very strong labour demand in Portugal, rather weak immigration policies in Portugal, but also transnational criminal networks operating between Eastern Europe and Portugal. A number of our respondents said that they were first the idea of coming to Portugal came from contact with Moldovans who were smuggling people across. So I hope you've been able to read the quotation. It was a very exploitative setup. There's a much longer history of Ukrainian migration to the UK. And so maybe I should stick with this for now. Ukrainian migration to the UK, going back to the 1940s. But the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of Ukraine in 1991 dramatically changed the conditions of migration. Now people were free to move and migration to the UK increased. When we come to Brazilians in Norway, the scale of the discussion changes dramatically. And there's been a long, the history of migration from Brazil to Norway has been a long one. But it's grown rapidly since 2000, more than doubling from 2005 to 2010. We're still talking in the sort of thousands. And what we're finding there is at the beginnings, a lot of it was about marriage migration. What's very striking there is that virtual connections were very important, ranging from pen pals in the 70s to now internet links, where people were establishing contacts and then they were forming into real relationships and many marriages. But those sorts of initial startups, and I haven't covered them in any detail, were then followed up with some feedback. And particularly, despite the rough start to Ukrainian migration to Portugal, a strong set of feedback mechanisms came into operation very quickly. Perhaps particularly because the migrants did get jobs. They did make money, despite the exploitation. And that provided an example for others. And moreover, employers encouraged their Ukrainian migrant workers to recruit others. The rapid influx of migrants and the involvement of criminal networks resulted in the Portuguese authorities and other EU states trying to gain control of the situation. So there was an institutional response. Policies of regularisation and the arrest of some of the criminal groups. How far this made a difference is open to debate, but it's clear the role of organised crime declined, but many migrants were now being drawn in by social networks, and their journeys were being organised by travel agents. When it comes to the migration from post-independence Ukraine to the UK, while the number of migrants has grown, the operation of systems feedback seems much more limited. The post-war history of migration and existing Ukrainian institutions in the UK seem to be important factors in stimulating some movement in the 1980s, but they didn't sustain much of the new migration, and at times they seem to have come to discourage it. I think I've got about 2 minutes left. I'm going to move on from that talk to actually move on to I'll just say very quickly, with Brazilians to Norway, there seems to be some evidence of some systemic characteristics in the migration pattern, where initial movements that were started through Norwegians to Brazil did result in some migration, further migration being facilitated by others. But it's small, but it's all quite small scale in Norway. But I'm not sure, I think there might be some systemic movements going on there. But I want to very quickly touch on the idea of the environment. Because for Ukrainians in Portugal, people's strategic interests in migration were concerned with employment. When the environment changed, the job market for Ukrainians shrank, the construction projects came to an end, the financial crisis hit, the flow of migration slowed down dramatically. Many Ukrainians left Portugal. The environment dramatically changed the way that migration happened. But there is still a migration link between Ukraine and Portugal. That is quite new. Migrants have settled, they've formed families, they've taken up citizenship and become a Portuguese life. So it does seem there is some relationship, and if the boom returns in some way, if there is a change in the economic situation, maybe that system will be reinvigorated. In contrast, when you come to the driving force of the movement of Ukrainians to London, it particularly seems to be concerned about London, about the structural position of London as an English-speaking global city with relatively affordable for people moving from Ukraine. Migration did slow down after the financial crisis, and some Ukrainians went back. But London still remains a very attractive destination for new migrations. And we also see that the migration from the Ukraine migration from Ukraine to the UK feels like it's a much weaker systemic quality to it. There's much less evidence of the feedback that we saw in the case of Ukrainians in Portugal. Again, I'm going to have to skip a bit of this on Brazilians in Norway, because I want to just very quickly go back to draw to a conclusion. I've got 1 minute left. I've tried to start filling in my table that I had at the beginning. And I'll show you the example here of Ukrainians moving to Portugal, where some of the elements that seem to have come out of the work that we've been doing. We have the information, we have the flows of information, remittances and return migrants. We have the people moving, and we also have some elements of social remittances moving back and forth. But also we see the institutions, the employment, the labour market and the high unemployment levels. Organised crime as an institution that has then given way. Much more role now for travel agents, and of course the role of migrant social networks. I won't try and explain this in great detail. It's a flavour, and it's something that I know I need to do a lot more work on. But I want to conclude by going back to this question. Okay, so I've suggested systems add something. It certainly, I think, is a useful heuristic device. It's setting up a relatively formal set of relationships. I think it asks us to probe more deeply than simple push-pull models, gravity models, or any idea of utility maximization. Perhaps we could get the same result by more complex modelling techniques, perhaps using agent-based modelling or such like. But I think whether a system is useful or not, I think comes down to questions of emergence. Are we seeing something more than the aggregation of individual behaviour? Do we need this notion of a system to make sense of these enduring patterns and relationships between places and these different entities? I think perhaps we do. The systems described above, especially in the case of Ukrainians in Portugal and to a lesser extent Brazilians in Norway, involve a changing set of institutional relationships that change migration between these countries, so that shape migration between these countries. I think we have the data now to trace out these interactions in much more detail. And I would stress what I'm presenting is a very preliminary analysis. I wouldn't claim to have completed the job yet. The migration system, as I see, is not impelling any individual to move. But it does certainly make it inevitable that some people, we don't know who, will move in particular directions. We see that movement has been shaped by a set of influences far beyond the potential migrant social network. It's a web of interconnected institutions that encourage migration in a particular way. And when someone chooses to move in that direction, perhaps they step into the web and they're caught and they start moving. It becomes more inevitable that they will go in that direction. Who comes into the system is indeterminate. And that's why I think we do need to incorporate a good understanding of agency. And I think there is some mixing of systems and agency that would still be useful. We know that Ukrainians are more likely to head for Portugal today than they were in 1995. It's not just about their individual aspirations and interests, though those play a crucial part, but also the pathway and connections that link those places. And by starting to work through the complex set of relationships that shape these movements, which takes us far beyond social networks, I think perhaps we can start to anticipate better how particular changes may change the patterns of migration. And to some extent, that's the ambition we have of doing a lot of the work within the THEMIS project. Thank you very much.